The prosecution has presented nothing but conjecture. I am confident the jury will see this for the farce it is.
They say that power is like a mask. But in my 35 years on this bench, I've found that power is actually a mirror. It doesn't change who you are. It simply reveals what has been hiding in your heart all along. I've sat behind this heavy mahogany bench for over 3 decades, watching the long human parade pass by. I've seen the broken-hearted seeking just a fragment of hope, and I've seen the arrogant seeking a way to bypass the truth. After 30 years, you start to believe you've seen every face of deception. You think you know the weight of every lie. But then comes a day that reminds you that some people don't just want to bend the law. They want to break the very foundation it stands on. I still feel the cold draft in the courtroom when I think about that particular Tuesday morning. It wasn't just the autumn air creeping in through the vents. It was the arrival of a man who believed his title made him a god in a room full of mortals. Before we get into the heart of this storm, I want to ask you something. If you believe that no one, no matter how high their office or how deep their pockets, is above the law, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We need to stand together for the truth, and your support is what keeps the doors of this courtroom open for real justice. Now let me tell you exactly how it all began. My morning always starts the same way. 5 a.m. The world is still draped in shadows, and the only sound in the house is the rhythmic, slow drip of the coffee machine. My grandfather was a carpenter in South Boston for 50 years. He was a man of very few words, but his hands, calloused and steady, spoke volumes. He used to tell me, "Simpson, a building is only as honest as its level. If the foundation is crooked, the roof will eventually crush everyone inside." He taught me that a level doesn't care if you're a beggar or a king. It doesn't care about your politics or your bank account. It only cares about the truth of the line. I carry his old wooden level in my briefcase every single day. It sits right there next to my gavel. It reminds me that my job isn't to be powerful. My job is to be the level, to make sure the line stays straight, no matter who is trying to tilt it. That Tuesday morning, the air in the courthouse felt heavy, charged with an electricity I couldn't quite name. My clerk, Sarah, who has the intuition of a seasoned detective, didn't give me her usual cheerful, "Good morning." She didn't even look me in the eye. She simply handed me the docket with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "Judge," she whispered, "Senator Sterling is in the building, and he didn't come alone. He brought a circus of cameras and a mountain of ego." I looked down at the file, case number 9928B. On the surface, it looked like a routine matter of building code violations and safety negligence at a high-rise complex. But when a United States senator shows up for a municipal hearing, you know it's never just about the paperwork. It's about a message. And the message he was sending, before he even opened his mouth, was that this courtroom was his stage, and I was just an extra in his play. He was about to find out that in this room there are no extras, only the law. The doors of the courtroom didn't just open. They were pushed aside with the kind of practiced authority that expects every obstacle to vanish. Senator Sterling entered with a wake of people behind him. Lawyers, aides, and a press secretary who was already scanning the room for the best camera angles. He moved with a heavy, deliberate swagger, the kind earned through decades of sitting in high-backed chairs and making decisions that affect millions. He was draped in a charcoal wool suit, tailored so perfectly that it seemed to repel the very dust of the courtroom. He didn't wait for his name to be called. He didn't wait for the bailiff to signal him forward. He walked straight to the defense table, dropped a gold monogram briefcase onto the wood, and looked up at me with a smile that was meant to be collegiate but felt like a dare. In his eyes, I saw the reflection of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be told no. He wasn't looking at a judge. He was looking at an obstacle he intended to move. But as I sat there, I wasn't focused on the gold on his wrists or the prestige of his title. I was thinking about the political note my clerk had left on my desk. It was a subtle warning that calls had been made, not to me, but to the people who oversee the funding of this very court. The message was clear. This wasn't supposed to be a trial. It was supposed to be a formality, a quiet dismissal of minor safety violations in exchange for a handshake and a vague political favor. I looked past the senator's expensive entourage to the very back row of the gallery. There sat Mrs. Gable. She was 84 years old, her spine curved like a question mark, wearing a coat that had seen better decades. Beside her sat a small portable oxygen tank. She lived in Sterling Towers, a building that bore the senator's family name in 10-foot tall neon letters on the skyline. Yet she was here because the emergency stairwells in that building had been blocked by construction debris for 6 months, and the fire alarms had been disconnected to save on maintenance costs. The senator leaned in, resting his elbows on the table, violating the invisible boundary of respect that usually holds this room together. "Judge Simpson," he began, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, echoing with the resonance of a man used to the Senate floor. "I think we both know why we're here. There's been a bit of a misunderstanding with the local building inspectors. A few missed signatures, a few outdated censors. I'm prepared to have my office cut a check for the maximum administrative fines today so we can all get back to our real work. I have a flight to Washington in less than 2 hours, and I'd hate for this triviality to delay the people's business." He spoke about human safety as if it were a ledger entry. He called the life-threatening negligence of an 84-year-old woman's home a triviality. He was offering to pay the court to look away, treating justice like a toll road where the wealthy get the fast lane. He looked at his watch, a timepiece that cost more than Mrs. Gable's entire annual pension, and sighed with the impatience of a man who thinks he is far too important for the truth. He was about to find out that while his flight might be in 2 hours, the law has all the time in the world. Senator Sterling checked his watch again, a sharp, impatient click of metal against skin that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. He didn't just expect me to agree, he expected me to apologize for the delay. He stood there, leaning slightly forward, projecting the image of a man whose time is worth more than the sanctuary of this courtroom. But I didn't reach for my gavel, and I didn't look at the check his lawyer was already sliding across the mahogany table. I looked at the senator's eyes, and what I saw there was the absolute absence of a conscience. "Senator," I said, keeping my voice low, as steady as the level in my grandfather's toolbox, "you spoke about a flight to Washington. You spoke about administrative fines as if they were nothing more than a nuisance tax for the privilege of ignoring the law. But you haven't mentioned Mrs. Gable. You haven't mentioned the 300 other souls living in Sterling Towers who went to sleep for 6 months without a working fire alarm because you decided that profit margins were more important than human breath." The senator's smile didn't vanish. It simply hardened into a mask of professional irritation. "Judge," he replied, his tone shifting to that condescending register politicians use when they think they're talking to a subordinate, "let's be realistic. Buildings of that size have maintenance cycles. My staff handles the details. I can't be expected to know the status of every smoke detector in a 30-story high-rise. I am a United States Senator. I deal with national security, international trade, and the federal budget. Surely you can understand that my focus is on the bigger picture." I leaned back, let the silence stretch until the air felt tight enough to snap. "The bigger picture," I repeated. "That is an interesting phrase. In this courtroom, the bigger picture is composed of thousands of small individual lives, and those lives are protected by rules. Rules that you seem to believe are merely suggestions for people of your standing." I reached for the folder Sarah had handed me earlier, the one with the shivering note attached. "I have something here that might sharpen your focus on that bigger picture, Senator. It's a note regarding a phone call made to the Judicial Oversight Committee yesterday afternoon. A call from your Chief of Staff inquiring about my retirement benefits and the upcoming budget for this municipal district. It was a subtle hand, Senator, a very professional threat. But here's the problem with trying to tilt the level. When you push on the truth eventually pushes back." I saw the senator's press secretary shift uncomfortably in the second row. The cameras were still rolling, but the narrative was starting to slip out of their control. Sterling's lawyers whispered urgently to him, but he brushed them off. He was used to winning. He was used to being the most powerful man in the room. He didn't realize that in this house, the power doesn't belong to the man in the charcoal suit or the man in the black robe. The power belongs to the law, and I was about to let the law speak with a voice he couldn't ignore. "Sarah," I said, turning to my clerk, "please project the digital evidence marked Exhibit C onto the screens. I want the senator to see exactly what he considers a trivial misunderstanding." As the screens flickered to life, the room went cold. It wasn't a building report. It was something much more personal, something that proved the senator hadn't just been negligent, he had been defiant. And in that moment, the charcoal suit couldn't protect him from the reality of what he had done. The screen behind me flickered to life, casting a cold blue glow across Senator Sterling's face. This wasn't a dry spreadsheet or a list of soulless statistics. It was a piece of digital truth, a security recording from the basement of Sterling Towers, captured just 3 months ago. In the video, Sterling is standing next to his building manager, surrounded by stacks of construction debris that completely blocked the only emergency exit for the entire south wing. His voice rang out in the recording, crystal clear and unmistakable. "Forget it," he said, waving a hand with lethal impatience. "Fixing the fire alarm system will cost another $200,000. We need that capital for the upcoming campaign. Just keep the emergency doors locked. Nobody ever goes down there to check anyway. If something happens, we'll blame the contractors. The people living here don't have the money or the status to move a finger against us." The courtroom went bone-dry silent. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the chilling silence of witnessing the true depth of human indifference. I looked over at the senator. The smugness, the polished statesman persona evaporated in an instant. In its place was a frantic twitch at the corner of his eye, not born of remorse, but of the raw fury of a predator caught in the light. He had forgotten that in this age even the shadows have eyes. Sterling couldn't contain himself any longer. He surged to his feet, shoving his heavy chair back so hard it slammed into the mahogany wainscoting with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "This is a pathetic fabrication," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a rage that stripped away his practiced baritone. "Simpson, who do you think you are? Do you honestly believe a small-town judge can dismantle a career like mine with a piece of trash recording? I am the one who shapes the policy of this nation. I am the one who decides the federal budgets. I can make this entire courthouse vanish with a single phone call before the sun sets today." He stormed forward, slamming his palms onto the defense table, leaning in until he was inches from my face. I could see the burst capillaries in his eyes and smell the expensive cigar smoke clinging to his charcoal wool. "You're playing with fire, Simpson. I will bury your career. I will make you regret the day you ever thought you were big enough to stand in my way. Do you have any idea how many men like you I've pushed into permanent darkness? Don't think that black robe protects you from the reach of my power." I didn't blink. I didn't lean back an inch. I felt my grandfather's level inside my briefcase, a silent anchor of truth in the middle of this man's storm. "Senator," I said, my voice low and cold enough to make the back row shiver, "you just made the single greatest mistake of your life. In Washington, perhaps you are the one who defines the law. But here, in this room, the law defines you. And every word of that threat you just uttered was captured by the very press cameras you invited here to witness your triumph." I looked at Mrs. Gable in the back row. She wasn't cowering. She was looking at Sterling with a quiet, devastating contempt. Sterling spun around, seeing the red lights of the cameras blinking in unison, realizing he had just set fire to the final bridge of his public life. His ego had become so bloated it had blinded him to the trap he had set for himself. "Bailiff," I said, my eyes locked on Sterling's, "instruct the senator to sit down immediately. If he utters one more word of intimidation toward this court or anyone in this room, I will have him detained instantly for obstruction of justice and threatening a public official." Sterling let out a jagged, mocking laugh. "You think you have the spine? You think you're going to cuff me in front of all these cameras? Go ahead, Simpson. Show the world you have the nerve, or admit you're just another clerk in a fancy robe." He had no idea that behind the side doors of the courtroom, another force had been waiting for the signal. There would be no phone calls this time. No political favors could reach him in the hole he had dug with his own arrogance. When the ego becomes a god, it eventually demands the sacrifice of the man who worships it. The echoes of the senator's jagged, mocking laugh hadn't even finished bouncing off the high marble ceilings when the side doors of the courtroom, the ones usually reserved for staff and security, swung open with a heavy, synchronized thud. Sterling didn't even turn around at first. He was too busy staring at me, his face twisted into a mask of defiant triumph. He thought the silence in the room was a sign of my hesitation. He thought he had finally bullied the law into submission. But the silence wasn't for me. It was for the three individuals who had just entered the room, moving with the quiet, lethal efficiency of people who don't need to shout to be heard. They weren't wearing charcoal wool or gold monogrammed accessories. They were wearing dark, functional suits and windbreakers with 3 yellow letters on the back that changed the entire molecular structure of the air in the room, FBI. Leading them was Special Agent Miller, a woman I had known for a decade, a person whose eyes held the same kind of steady, unblinking truth as my grandfather's level. She didn't look at the cameras and she didn't look at the press. She walked straight to the center of the well between me and the man who thought he owned the city. Sterling's laugh died a sudden choked death. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his cell phone as if he could still dial his way out of reality. "What is this?" he stammered, the practiced baritone of his voice replaced by a thin, high-pitched tremor. "Miller? What are you doing here? I'm in the middle of a municipal hearing. This is a local matter. You have no jurisdiction in this courtroom." Agent Miller didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She held up a single sheet of paper, a federal warrant signed by a district judge 3 hours ago. "Senator Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel, "we aren't here for the building codes. We are here in connection with an ongoing federal investigation into racketeering, insurance fraud, and the misappropriation of campaign funds. Specifically, the $200,000 you redirected from the Sterling Tower Safety Fund to your re-election account. We have the wire transfers, we have the testimonies, and as of 10 minutes ago, we have your chief of staff in custody." The senator's face drained of color until it was the same sickly gray as the ash of his expensive cigars. The charcoal suit that had looked like armor just minutes ago now looked like a shroud. He looked at his lawyers, but they were already stepping away from him, their hands raised in a silent gesture of professional abandonment. They were sharks, and they knew when the water was full of blood. Sterling turned back to me, his eyes wide, searching for a mercy he had spent his entire life denying others. "Judge Simpson," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. "You can't let them do this. Not like this. Not in front of the cameras." I leaned forward, looking past his title, past his wealth, and straight into the hollow shell of the man he had become. "Senator," I said, the words heavy and final, "you asked for the world to see my nerve. You asked for the world to watch, and they are watching. They are watching a man who thought he was a god discover that he is merely a citizen, and a criminal one at that. You spoke about being unequal to people like Mrs. Gable. You were right. She has her dignity. You have nothing but a charcoal suit and a warrant." I looked at the bailiff and then at Agent Miller. "The court recognizes the federal warrant. Bailiff, assist the agents. Senator Sterling, you are under arrest. And since you were so concerned about my spine, I think it's only appropriate that you leave this room exactly the way you earned, in handcuffs, on the spot." The sound of the first metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the room like a gavel strike. It was the sound of the line finally being leveled. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place was not loud, but it was the most definitive sound ever heard in this courtroom. It was a cold metallic click that signaled the end of a dynasty and the beginning of a reckoning. Senator Sterling stared down at his wrists as if they had been grafted onto someone else's body. For a man who had spent 40 years shaking hands with presidents and signing billion-dollar bills into law, the feel of cold steel was a language he simply did not understand. He looked at the cameras, but for the first time in his life, he didn't have a soundbite. He didn't have a spin. He only had the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized that his mirror had finally shattered. The gallery remained in a state of suspended animation. No one cheered. No one shouted. There was only a heavy collective intake of breath. I looked back at Mrs. Gable. She wasn't smiling. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, exhausted relief. The kind of look a person gives when a long, agonizing fever finally breaks. She reached for her oxygen tank, her hand steady now, and for the first time since she walked into this room, she looked like she could finally breathe without effort. She had been seen, she had been heard, and in this small corner of the world, the line had been made straight again. I turned my attention back to the senator as Agent Miller began to lead him away. He stumbled slightly, his polished Gucci loafers losing their grip on the floor he thought he owned. I called his name one last time. Senator Sterling. He stopped, turning his head slowly, the charcoal suit now rumpled, his tie askew. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by the frail, desperate reality of a man who had traded his soul for a title. You spent your life building towers with your name on them, I said, my voice echoing in the absolute silence. You thought that if you built them high enough, you would be beyond the reach of the ground. But you forgot what my grandfather knew. You forgot that a building is only as strong as its foundation. You built your legacy on the backs of people like Mrs. Gable, using their safety as currency for your ambition. You didn't build a legacy, Senator. You built a monument to your own vanity, and today the foundation gave way. Sterling opened his mouth as if to speak, to offer one last threat or one last bribe. But Agent Miller gave his arm a firm, professional nudge. He was no longer the Honorable Senator Sterling. He was a federal defendant. He was led out through the same side doors he had once used as a private entrance to avoid the common people. As the doors swung shut behind him, the tension in the room didn't just dissipate. It transformed into a profound lesson for everyone remaining. I looked out at the young law students sitting in the jury box, their notebooks open, their faces pale with the shock of what they had just witnessed. They had come here to learn about procedures and statutes, but they had received a master class in the human soul. I picked up my grandfather's level from the bench and held it up so they could all see the simple bubble of air suspended in the glass. Power is a temporary loan, I told them. Integrity is the only thing you truly own. Never trade what you own for something you're only borrowing. The courtroom eventually emptied, the heavy oak doors swinging shut for the final time that afternoon. The frantic energy of the press had followed the FBI SUVs out into the street, chasing the charcoal suit as it was ushered into the back of a government vehicle. Inside, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence than the one we started with. It was the silence that follows a storm. The air was cleaner, the pressure had dropped, and the truth was finally allowed to sit in the room without being shouted over. I stayed behind the bench for a long time, watching Sarah organize the files. I looked at the spot where Senator Sterling had stood, where he had slammed his hands down and promised to bury me. There was nothing left there now but a faint smudge on the polished wood. It's a recurring lesson in this life. The people who scream the loudest about their power are usually the ones most terrified of the moment they have to stand without it. Without the title, without the donors, without the Uncle Rich names on the buildings. Sterling was just a man in a rumpled suit facing a cold reality he couldn't bribe. As I was gathering my notes, I saw Mrs. Gable still sitting in the back row. She was slowly putting her oxygen tank into its little rolling cart. I stood up and walked down from the bench, something I rarely do while the public is still in the room. I met her at the railing. She looked up at me, her eyes clouded by age but sharp with a clarity that only comes from surviving. She didn't thank me for the ruling. She didn't have to. She simply reached out and placed a hand, thin as parchment, on my arm. "Judge," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. For 6 months, I felt like a ghost in my own hallway. I felt like I didn't exist because my safety didn't show up on a balance sheet. Today, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground again. I told her that she wasn't the one who was a ghost. Sterling was the one living in a phantom world of his own making. I watched her walk out, slow and steady, her oxygen tank clicking rhythmically against the floor. That afternoon, the municipal building inspectors, the ones who had been persuaded to look the other way for months, were suddenly very busy. By sunset, a court-appointed receiver had been placed in charge of Sterling Towers. The construction debris was cleared from the emergency exits within 3 hours. The fire alarms were being reconnected by a crew that worked through the night. Justice isn't just the moment the handcuffs click, it's the repair of the world that follows. It's the fire alarm that finally works. It's the emergency door that finally opens. It's the elderly woman who can sleep without wondering if her hallway is a trap. I went back to my chambers and took out my grandfather's level. I thought about those ripples. One honest line in a courtroom can lead to 300 people sleeping safely in a high-rise across town. The level doesn't just measure a board. It measures the integrity of the whole house. And that night, the house was a little more honest than it had been that morning. Justice is often described as a blindfolded goddess, but in my experience, justice is actually a long, slow conversation between the truth and the passage of time. 6 months after Senator Sterling was led out of this courtroom in handcuffs, that conversation reached its final chapter. The federal trial was swift, stripped of the political theater and the charcoal suit bravado that had once defined him. The evidence I saw on my screen that Tuesday morning was only the tip of a very dark iceberg. When the FBI finished digging, they found a legacy built not on service, but on systemic theft. The final verdict came down on a Tuesday, the same day of the week it all began. 18 years in a federal facility, no parole, no special treatment. The man who once bragged that a parking ticket couldn't touch him discovered that the law has a very long reach and an even longer memory. The Sterling name was stripped from the skyline of this city as part of a massive asset forfeiture. The buildings were sold to a non-profit housing authority, and the first thing the new owners did was rename the high-rise. They didn't name it after a politician or a donor. They named it Gable Manor. I visited the building recently, not as a judge, but as a citizen. I saw Mrs. Gable sitting on a bench in the courtyard. The emergency exits were clear, the sensors were new, and the air felt light. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a woman who knew her worth. We didn't speak about the senator. We didn't need to. The world had been corrected, and that was enough. As I walked back to my car, I thought about how easy it is to be fooled by the high-rise and the charcoal suit, and how hard it is to remember that the only thing that truly holds a structure up is the integrity of the people inside it. I'm back in my chambers now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across my grandfather's wooden level. People often ask me why I stay on this bench after 35 years. They ask if I ever get tired of the lies and the arrogance. The answer is simple. I stay. Because for every Senator Sterling who tries to tilt the line, there is a Mrs. Gable who deserves to see it made straight. I stay because the law is the only thing we have that treats the beggar and the king with the same unflinching honesty. If this story reminded you that character is more valuable than any title, then I've done my job today. Do me one last favor. Share this video. Not for the drama, but for the reminder that justice still matters. Leave a comment and tell me about a time you saw the truth win against the odds. I read them all, and they remind me why this work is worth the wait. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join our community of people who believe in the level. My grandfather used to say that a good day's work is measured by the line you leave behind. I hope today's line was straight. I'm Judge Simpson. Take care of each other, stand your ground, and never let anyone convince you that their power is greater than your truth. God bless.